And what a reminder for us that, what are we putting off in just our daily lives? So, how are we letting things like overwhelmment and fear and anxiety keep us from really being in the present moment and embracing this life? It's just such a fantastic message. Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So, this week is Halloween, yes? So I have a few Halloween jokes for you. Okay, what did the ghost say to the man at the coffee shop? Screamer sugar. Who was the most famous French skeleton? Napoleon Bonaparte. Where do most werewolves live? In Hollywood, California. What do Italians eat on Halloween? Fettuccine Alfredo. Okay, last one. Why did the headless horseman go into business? Because he wanted to get ahead in life. Wah, wah, wah. But you'll laugh, so that's good. I want to start with a little story that I read just the other day, and it's about he was a 6 or 7-year-old little boy that got his first two-wheel bike. So he was really excited to learn how to ride this bike, and so he went to the top of this hill, and there was a retired preacher that happened to be watching this little boy. So this little boy gets on his bike, and he's really excited about, going down, and he starts to go down the hill, and he's wobbling, and he's wobbling, and he's wobbling, and he gets to the bottom of the hill, and he falls, and he scrapes his elbow, and he says, "I'll be damned." I know, shocked that I said that in church, huh? So he gets back on his bike and he goes back up to the top of the hill, and he's like, "Okay, this time I'm going to do it," So he goes down, wobble, 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 falls again, and he scrapes. Was it his elbow the first time? His knee the second time. And he gets up and he goes, "I'll be damned." So he gets up and he goes up to the top of the hill, and the preacher says, son, try saying, "Praise God." So the little boy goes, "Okay." So he's at the top of the hill, and he's like, "Okay." So he goes down, and he stays stable all the way down. And he gets down to the bottom, and he's still upright on his bike, and he says, "Praise God." And in that moment, his knee is healed, and his elbow is healed, and the minister stands up, and he said, "I'll be damned." The moral of the story is, are we living what we say that we believe? Or are we just parroting these words? Is it still in our head and not really a part of who we are, and that we're showing up truly believing what it is that we say that we believe? So with Halloween being just around the corner, I do enjoy doing talks that are kind of theme-based, and sometimes I've talked about, the masks that we wear. Sometimes I talk about scary things, but today I'm going to talk about fear, and not things that we are afraid of, but rather today my intention is to offer a different paradigm about this concept called fear, and to create maybe a different relationship with this idea of fear. This is actually a talk that I'm reprising from a talk that I did in 2011. Now, I recognize that up until a certain point in my life, I had lived really into a good part of my mature adulthood with a lot of fear. And so some of those fears were things like I wasn't good enough, I wasn't a good enough mom, a good enough daughter, a good enough wife, a good enough board member. I had fear of people and their intentions. My dad was very protective of us, and that came out as, fear the world. It's a big scary place. I had fear of the future. What if I die, and what is going to happen to my children, or am I going to have enough money for retirement? I had a huge, huge fear of death until I came to Unity. But mostly the fear that I dealt with was a fear of not being good enough, a fear of not just being seen and accepted for who I was, even though at that time I wasn't really showing up for people to be able to see who I was. But that showed up as meekness and shyness and not being authentic. Now, I recognize that some of the physical expressions of fear were things like sleeplessness and anxiety, the heart palpitating, shortness of breath, the pit in the stomach, blood pressure up, and illness such as headaches, and even heart disease can come from living life in too much fear. And then some of the ways that fear kind of acted out in my life were things like anger and resentment, unrighteous judgment, undue criticism. Fear can show up as aggressive behavior, and fear can show up as meekness, worry, things like that. So anybody ever deal with any kind of those symptoms at all, or expressions in our lives? So what I did was I went to our good friend Webster and I looked up fear. And I found that it's a very multifaceted idea. And so what it started out with was what we would call the good fear. So that it was kind of, categorized in good and bad. So the good fear is a feeling of agitation and anxiety caused by the presence or imminence of danger. And we would consider that a good fear because that is that warning for us. A hurricane's coming. That fear is going to help us do something to get out of harm's way, things like that. So we would call that a good fear. Now, the bad fears were these: a state or condition marked by this feeling, living in fear. A feeling of disquiet or apprehension, a fear of looking foolish, fear of failing, of not being enough. And then a reason for dread or apprehension. Being alone is my greatest fear. Losing money is my greatest fear. Who's going to be the next president? What is the economy going to do? So these are, those feelings of dread or apprehension. So as a general rule, we would call these pretty negative fears, right? Yes, okay. Because they seem to serve no purpose other than to keep us from really expressing the light and the brilliance that we came here to express, and to live the life that is within us to be lived. Fear can stop that from happening. So as I said, not as I said, but as long as we look at fear as something that is against us, as something that is separate from us, something that is trying to trip us up, then it's going to stagnate, and many times it's going to literally halt our growth personally and spiritually. Because here's the thing, and I want you to know this: fear is a natural part of our human experience. Fear is not a bad thing. You're not a terrible person, or you're not being spiritual enough if you have some fear in your life. It is absolutely normal. And even, the greatest among us, when we look at Jesus, Jesus experienced fear as well. And so it's just a normal part of our human process. So let me ask you if you recognize some of these quotes, because these are quotes that I've heard about fear, and probably you've heard most of them too. We have to conquer fear. Face your fear. Do things in spite of fear. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Do the thing you fear, and the death of fear is certain. Love is always creative. Fear is always destructive. The enemy is fear. Do you recognize some, if not most, of those quotes? And I understand how on one hand they could be looked at as being somewhat inspiring, but the reality, you guys, is they scream of duality. And this was somebody quoted something, and then somebody else thought, hey, yeah, that's a great quote, and all of a sudden we've got these quotes that we live by. And I really hope that today we're going to shift that, because I'm going to tell you that we're looking at it like that. It's almost as if fear is a power of its own. Right? When we look at it from that perspective. And when we go to the third principle of unity, which is thoughts held in mind produce after their kind, what we focus on expands. As long as we have this consciousness of fear, then not only will it continue to be that in our life, but it will expand as this big negative thing that is against us, and it will dictate the choices that we make in our lives. And here's the thing about it, you guys: we will miss so many opportunities in life because we are so we're so in that place of fear, and it will keep us small. And that's the last thing that we want to do. That's the last thing that we're about, is staying small and not letting whatever is here to express be that which expresses through us. So I want to share with you how my paradigm shifted with fear. And this was actually in about 2006, 2007, when I was going through my licensed teacher training. And I was up at Unity Village, and I was taking classes, and one of our instructors guided us in a meditation relaxation and a guided imagery. And so what he had us do, now, going into this, there was no preconceived idea about anything. This was just whatever's going to show up for you is going to show up for you. So he guides us, and it's a beautiful summer day, and we can, guided imagery, we can see that the sun is shining, beautiful blue sky, a couple of clouds here and there. And then he had us smell the crispness of the air from that transition from spring into summer. And then on the other side of the woods, there was a hill, and we were to walk up this hill. And when we got to the top of the hill, we were to see a house. Now, the house that I saw, which is not unusual for me because I do have a tendency to look through rose-colored glasses, was the cute little white picket fence house that was just pristine. It had, just the right amount of bushes and flowers, and it was beautifully painted. It was just this wonderful, wonderful backdrop. So then he told us we were to knock on the door, and then to allow whatever appeared to appear. Well, for me, when I knocked on the door, fear opened the door. Now, here's the thing about how fear showed up for me, because I would have thought fear would have been some big, monstrous creature. But for me, fear showed up, and it looked like a stick of gum. And it had a head and arms and legs. It was essentially white, but it had a little bit of gray at the bottom. And it had like a Dean Martin kind of a feel, like kind of had the martini in its hand, real laid back. That's just what my vision was. So we were prompted to ask some questions and then allow it to answer us. I'm going to share with you what the conversation was. So the question I was to ask is, what do you want from me? And fear said, I simply want you to acknowledge me, to know that I serve a purpose in your life. My next question was, well, what can I do for you? And fear said, love and accept me. The next question I was prompted to ask is, what gift can you give me? And the answer to this question was freedom, which was really odd, that I'm having fear tell me it's going to give me freedom. And then the next question is, what else would you like to say to me? And here's what fear said. I am not a negative thing. I am a reminder for you when you are not consciously connected to Source. I desire only good for you. I support you in being all that you were created to be. I bless you to fly away as a butterfly, and I will always be here to remind you when you are not looking to Source. Then it said, by the way, I'm so happy that I'm not dominant in your life anymore. It was a lot of work. I'm enjoying a simpler life now. Time to relax, garden, and just enjoy. And I support you. So all this time in my life, I saw fear as this adversary, as this something that was against me, as really, I think about how every week we come here and we say there's only one presence and one power in the universe and in my life, God the good, omnipotent, all except fear. Fear was a power too. And we can expand that. The economy is a power, or an illness is a power, or whatever is going on in our life. And that's why I say it's important for us to really start looking at, am I really living authentically what it is that in my soul I know is true? Or am I still in my head somewhere and I'm not living from that place? So what I finally got was there was only God, and God speaks to us in many languages, and that fear was simply one of those languages. This was a huge paradigm shift in my life when I could begin to look at it from this perspective. And I loved it when fear said, I am simply here to remind you when you are not looking, when you are not connected, consciously connected to source. I'm simply here to remind you of that. Does that sound like an adversary? Does that sound like something trying to trip us up? Does that sound like a power in and of itself? No, not at all. Now, I went to a book by Dr. Roger Teal called This Life is Joy, because I was thinking that I remembered that he had a chapter on fear. And sure enough, his chapter was something like, fear is your friend, something like that, which was like, oh, that's perfect. So Roger says, fear is a friend that shows up to tell us that it's time to open our hearts again and to enter into the Spirit divine, which is now and forevermore love. Perfect love casts out fear. And we know that 1 John 4:8 tells us God is love. So when fear comes along and we feel it, and we can feel it in our bodies, we're acting out in certain ways, that's just the reminder to come back to center, to come back. We're out here in the world, and we're not consciously connected and remembering that perfect love, being in that place of love, casts out that fear. So I want to share with you a story that Roger tells. He calls it the entry mat, and he said that there was a woman in his congregation who had a little granddaughter that was just starting to walk. And, those of us who have had kids or grandkids we know, or nieces and nephews, when they first are walking, everybody's so excited about it. And so this little girl was walking around, and all of a sudden she went into the foyer, and they heard her starting to cry. And so he says, she came upon something new in that foyer, and it was a thick entryway mat in front of the door. And she stood there at the edge of this mat, and confused and frightened, she was not about to step up onto that contraption. So faced with this challenge from something so unknown, the little girl began to cry with everything in her being. So of course the grandmother jumps up, she runs in there, she assesses the situation, she hugs her, and then she herself steps up on the mat, and she puts her hand out for the little girl to take her hand and step up as well. Well, the little girl paused, still skeptical about that mat, but it was her grandma. And so she went ahead and placed her little hand into her grandmother's and gingerly stepped onto that mat. And after a few moments, when nothing happened, she just let out a squeal of delight, and they could not get her off of that mat afterwards. She was up and down and up and down. And Roger says the little girl was having her first experience of something we all encounter over and over in our lives, and that is fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown. And so he says, what is the entry mat in your life? What is it that you're standing in front of, but you're afraid to take that next step, or you're afraid to step up onto it? So he said that just a little while later, this same grandmother ended up being diagnosed with breast cancer. And as you can imagine, she was devastated by this. And he said that, she was feeling very disconnected from spirit. And she came in to talk to him, and he said, at one point, this cancer is your entry mat, and the great presence has extended its hand to you. You can step forward in that love and forge a deeper trusting than you've ever known. And could that be your gift here? And he said, tears of realization welled up within her. She really just stepped into that trusting and that knowing that God was right there with her, source was there, that the life energy was there. And 2 years later, she ended up being cancer-free. And the thing about this is it's just that reminder that where are we focused? Are we focused in the world? Are we focused in the past? Are we focused on what people are saying? Are we focused even just in, because fear shows up as overwhelmment. I've got so much on my plate, I'm not getting it all done. It's a fear, and all of this stuff, the thing about it is that we have the opportunity many times a day to recognize when we're in fear. This isn't just about big fears in our life. I think probably the main thing for us to get a hold of is our daily experiences that we're having, and how many times throughout the day are we over here and fear shows up as one of those things, and it's simply saying, come back to the highlighted route, come back to the highlighted route, come back to center. So Roger gives us a couple of steps for us to be able to embrace this. And he said the first thing is to link up. Link up with your source. There is nothing more powerful than our conscious connection with God, with the Spirit, that infinite indwelling source of our lives and of all good. This is the step of remembering the provision of God for all of us, no matter who we are, what we've ever done, or what we now face, all of us, all the time. Come back to center. Come back to center. Again, I just want to remind you, you're going to know you're off center. You're feeling it in your body, right? We know it. We feel it. And many times we're acting out. And that's just that reminder. And I love this, one of my favorite scriptures, wake up, O sleeper, and rise, that the Christ may shine its light upon your path. And we have to wake up and become aware so that we can turn back to the center and allow that Christ light to shine for us. He says, admit that there is fear, don't lie about it, unmask it and reveal it. It's so important. I love also, what we resist persists. And so if we just act, sometimes I'm going to be all spiritual and say, I don't have any fears, I don't fear anything, and yet it's right there. And what we resist, it actually becomes bigger in our lives. It's okay. I just want to tell you, you're okay. It's okay that you have fear. Just, admit that it is there. Call the presence and power of God into your consciousness and allow your sense of the divine presence to energize a greater experience of love until you can love yourself fully and even love the fear itself. Perfect love casts out fear. So we link up first to source. But another important thing, you guys, is to link up to other people who can support you in this journey. You're not intended to do this alone. You've never been intended to do this alone. And that's why, for me, it's important to be part of a spiritual community with people who are like-minded, so that when you come and you say, I'm really dealing with this, that they can meet you where you are, but they can also remind you. They can be that person that helps you get back to center. I don't know about you, but I know sometimes just out in the world, when you may share a fear, you may have people going, oh yeah, I know what you mean. This happened to so-and-so, or this happened to me, and it just builds the fear. And what we're doing is we're coming together as like-minded people, but we're reminding each other of the greater truth, the greater reality. And then the second thing he says is to leap up. And this is about that there comes a time when we must allow ourselves to step into that unknown, into that uncomfortableness, to become what we have come here to be. And he quotes Abraham Maslow. He says, life is a process of choices, one after another. At each point, there is a progression choice and a regression choice. There may be a movement toward defense, toward safety, toward being afraid, but over on the other side, there is a growth choice. To make the growth choice instead of the fear choice 12 times a day is to move 12 times a day toward self-actualization. And self-actualization is an ongoing process for us. And so it's just that awareness that, guess what? We deal with this stuff all the time. Can we admit that? Yeah, we do. We deal with this stuff all the time. But we're empowered. And hopefully we have maybe a little bit of a different paradigm of what fear is in our lives. That it's God's language. And it's just that reminder, call for us. And I kind of came up with this acronym for fear, that fear is our friend. It's our encourager. It's our ally. And it's our reminder to come back. Come back and remember. Come back and live what you know to be true. Come back and remember that you are never alone. Even unto the ends of the earth, I will be with you. You are never alone. That God's source, whatever you want to call this, it's always right here for you and is always supporting you, is loving you completely and unconditionally every nanosecond without fail. And so your homework this week, you guys, is just to make friends with fear. It's just to open yourself up, to bless it, to know it's just God's language speaking and saying, come back, because I got you, and I will always have you. And that, my friends, is absolutely the truth. And so it is, and so it shall be. And I say to you,